for over 40 months, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we start again in the southwest of Ukraine's Donetsk region, where the Russian army has successfully taken control of another small settlement, the town of Myrnohrad. We're now witnessing these massive attacks that were launched on Myrnohrad even before any forces could get anywhere near the town itself. These are FAB bombs once more, but we've likely also witnessed thermobaric explosions from the TOS-1A system, which was deployed here. And now we're seeing that after essentially shooting the entire attack from a distance, in the truest sense of the word, there are the assaults on the Ukrainian units who were defending Myrnohrad at that time. This means that the assumption by some that there were no Ukrainians left here, that they had essentially withdrawn, is incorrect. Ukraine is making substantial efforts to defend the small towns, actively working to sustain the crucial logistics for the defenders currently stationed within these settlements. We observe this through Russian equipment. However, there are simply too few, and these Russian drones persistently strike. Here we can see them in action. These are massive drone attacks from which we observe, for instance, this house now entirely collapsing due to the drone strike, and there could have been Ukrainian defenders stationed there at that precise moment. Then they would be, as we observe here now, at the very least forced into retreat, if not even killed outright. From the helmet perspective of the Russians, we now see that they are engaging in house-to-house combat, demonstrating that this is no simple operation but involves intense and ongoing battle engagements. Right on the spot in these houses here. However, in the end, we do see relatively clearly that the Russian flags are being raised in the various houses or along the different streets, where we had just seen the Ukrainians at work. And in that sense, now we see it here as the Russians once again try to show this is the entire place and this is the central intersection. We now see Russian soldiers standing here quite openly, and they are indeed able to raise their flag. This here is the largest building in the area, also relatively prominent, and we now see the Russian flag, which is being waved in front by a soldier. And this clearly indicates that Myrnohrad, the final suburb close to Komar, which was taken over roughly a month ago, has now also fully and completely fallen under Russian control. We see the whole thing, a relatively small village, just 4 or 5 streets, but it's the sheer number of villages that we've been reporting on consistently in recent weeks that have fallen here. In total, around 20 villages in just 1 month, which means nearly a village every single day. Currently, there are only 9 small villages that remain under Ukraine's control in this specific area of the Donetsk region. After that, it lost the entire western section of the Donetsk region here to Russian military forces. We'll also take a closer look at the entire situation on the map and observe, as mentioned, we are of course located in the southeast of Ukraine, but specifically in a region, here we can clearly see it, where Ukraine... Let's briefly pause here. Just in this small area, we can clearly see on the side of the dashed line, they still maintain control over a few villages. After that, it's actually over, then nothing would be controlled in the net in this part anymore, but the Russians are approaching the regional border to Dnipropetrovsk, and that's right there, where they will at least halt their advance, or if you believe certain media reports, including those from Russia, then the Russians are planning a major offensive in the direction of Dnipropetrovsk. To do that, they first need to conquer the entire oblast border, and what we just saw were, as I mentioned, images from Myrnohrad. Here we see the map provider Deep State remains slightly more cautious, suggesting that intense fighting persists around the village. However, we had just seen relatively clearly that after heavy fighting, after massive battles around this village, the Russians faced no more resistance, at least within the village itself, but could move relatively freely here. And we see that Myrnohrad was the last suburb of Komar that was still, under Ukrainian control. Otherwise, we can observe, as previously mentioned, the entire movement is coming from the eastern direction. Back then, it happened in May, and now we are in July. This means the Russian troops have advanced approximately 20 kilometers further to the northwest, and this has been in a state of continuous movement, as we've clearly observed. In a movement, one that's advancing more rapidly than in any other part of the front at this current time. From the southwest of the Donetsk region, we move to the center. There, several cities are currently under threat. Let's take a look at the map here and see that the Russians have managed, with their strategy, to create what is essentially a dual threat. Specifically for 3 Ukrainian cities, we can see that quite clearly on this map. This entire central area would essentially be fully captured, bringing it completely under their control and expanding their dominance. Let me try to mark it here. This entire region has been conquered and controlled since April of this year. That's an absolutely massive area. Up here, this entire stretch spans 11 kilometers. With this wedge that was effectively driven across the N32. We've long observed that this road has been defended since the year before last, and the Russians haven't managed to cross it. Now everything has changed, and now there's essentially a major risk that through this wedge, Kostyantynivka could be threatened, theoretically, if the Ukrainians continue to lose ground here. A pocket around this city could be formed, as well as, and this is even more dangerous, one might say, advancing further here. This is currently happening. Myrnohrad, once home to 41,000 residents, and Pokrovsk, with a population of 65,000, would be severely threatened in this area. And that would indeed be a huge loss for the Ukrainians. And it's already interesting, we can see here at the bottom that the Russians have actually been held back for a long time here in the south of Pokrovsk. There has been no movement here for over a year now. And then the Russians found a way, so to speak, to strike on a different axis, pushing forward right here in the center and currently pressing both towards Yablonivka and towards Kostyantynivka, as well as the recent capture of the small village Myrn, and additionally threatening one of the last suburbs, known as Novoekonomichne. Before reaching Myrnohrad, now these towns located here, or this twin city Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad, as major goals, we'll primarily be focusing on footage from the Rudinsky region. This is another location home to several thousand inhabitants that still remains under Ukrainian control. And now we can clearly see how the Russians are advancing here, attempting to completely obliterate Ukrainian supply lines through massive strikes with their fiber optic drones. All the drone attacks we're seeing right now are from the Rudinsky area, essentially in the broader region around Pokrovsk. And now we see how the Russians are proceeding here with their fiber optic drones, creating a really large number of Ukrainian vehicles destroyed. And interestingly, as we can now see quite clearly here, the Ukrainians had made a last-minute attempt to net these roads as well. This was done to defend against drones. We can observe this once in this direction and once over there. These are the drone nets that were set up here, which are essentially standing on the road in both directions. But it's missing the net roof, so to speak. The upper net is what's not there yet. They didn't manage to build that in Ukraine anymore because the Russians advanced so quickly. And now they are facing a truly fatal situation here, as the Russians are targeting these crucial logistics routes with their kamikaze drones from above and continuously striking them. Here again you can see it, this is actually the same road. Here once more these net structures on both sides. However, the net is missing at the top, and that is a really big problem for Ukraine. Earlier we talked about the road of death, the Russian army near the south of Pokrovsk. This here, if you will, the road of death for the Ukrainian army north of Pokrovsk. We are seeing a truly massive number of wrecks scattered everywhere from Ukrainian units, and yet the Ukrainians somehow have to supply their troops, repeatedly trying it even with Humvees, as we just saw, though for the most part also with pickups and civilian vehicles, and they are repeatedly being attacked by Russian kamikaze drones. This means we see that the Russians have directed a significant portion of their drone force right here towards these roads, towards Rudinsky, precisely to cut off the Ukrainian supply lines and achieve that objective. After it was not successful in the south to encircle Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, and also in the north. To bypass these cities, once again attempting to, if you will, creating a pocket that doesn't yet exist, but they are trying. Here it's also quite interesting to see again how incredibly precise these kamikaze drones are with fiber optics. So here we see a single opening. Somehow, for whatever reason, this door here remained open, and the Russian drone is now flying directly into this gap to skillfully maneuver past the grating and strike the Ukrainian tank precisely where it's most exposed and defenseless. Yes, these recordings are truly alarming because they also show how incredibly high the losses of the Ukrainian army are, both with vehicles on the road as well as vehicles that are stationed in the various trench systems. And it clearly demonstrates the strong Russian determination to keep advancing forward here. Not only in the south or southwest of Donetsk, as we've just seen, but also around the cities of Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka in order to achieve the next major success, to capture the next major city. The last city that was successfully taken was Kurakhove, which happened at the start of the year in January. Since then, the Russians haven't captured any city in Ukraine. Let's stay in the Donetsk region and take another look at a video from last week. We had reported there that a so-called Tsar tank, an extensively modified Russian armored vehicle, required 60 drones, as it was struck by that exact number, before it could finally be destroyed near Donetsk. And here we have another footage from the Ukrainian side, which clearly illustrates how these precise strikes unfolded in that location. Because we had received messages from some viewers who mentioned, okay, but that was only 2 or 3 drones, and then it was eventually destroyed in the end after all. However, and this is the crucial point here, in this attack, various Ukrainian units had taken over the defense, and we only had reports from one unit, or rather 2, one that had filmed the attack and another that had filmed the burning tank afterward. We received those recordings, but now there are more and more units showing us that this is that Tsar tank, this heavily modified one. That's the second one. It's less protected. We're now witnessing this tank being attacked repeatedly, even by this by the drone patrol unit, which has also been mobilized in Donetsk to reinforce the defense efforts. And we repeatedly witness how this first vehicle of the two is struck, how it is being targeted and attacked. And yet we see that it still keeps moving. It's hit by drone strike after drone strike. Here we see it, the vehicle is still in motion, and yet it keeps going. And overall, according to Ukrainian sources, not Russian ones, it took 60 FPV kamikaze drones to destroy this so-called Tsar tank completely. And I think these images truly drive the point home. They vividly illustrate just how advanced the Russian defense efforts are on one hand, deploying all these steel structures to effectively shield such vehicles that have been constructed onto them. On the other hand, they also clearly show that in the end, there's no such thing as an invincible tank, and the Ukrainians still managed to find ways to eventually destroy these armored vehicles. And that's the second one targeted here. It managed to move forward because it wasn't hit hard at first, but then ended up getting stuck in a meadow over there. And this is the Tsar tank again. Relatively well visible. It's worth pausing at the right moment where we can see these modifications here, these entire constructions. So this is really steel. These are essentially like fences that were built on it, constructed downwards, upwards, going over the tracks. And in the end, they managed it, presumably because the crew had fled here as well, that they had this hatch here. And then a drone flew right inside sometime after it had been opened up. And then there was also the destruction of the Tsar tank, the so-called Tsar tank, which actually took an astonishingly, incredibly long time. The day had already begun, and it wasn't until late into the night that the operation was fully completed, ultimately concluding with the Ukrainian army successfully managing to destroy this vehicle. From Donetsk, we go to Sumy in the northeast of Ukraine. Here too, there is new footage from the Ukrainian army showing us that the Russians still hold some villages in the area. However, the movement of the Russian army has significantly slowed down. In part, it's a large grey zone where Russian soldiers do exist, but they no longer advance to attack because they are hiding from so many Ukrainian defenders and especially kamikaze drones at the moment. Now we see footage from Kindrka, one of 15 places that are now under Russian control. This here is the school, a completely destroyed school in Kindrka. And the Ukrainians, or rather the 225th Battalion, is now going to show us this is what the place looks like. It's completely destroyed by the Russians. Supposedly Russians are still in there. We don't see any Ukrainian troops or flags around here though. But after the Russians released the footage claiming they had captured Kindrka, we see very little evidence of that here. And that very much suggests that it is currently an absolute death zone where no one can move around. The Russians are essentially hiding in the basements, unable to make any further advances here. It's kind of like a stalemate situation. That means the village remains under Russian control. The Russians aren't coming out, they're no longer showing themselves. And the Ukrainians, that has always been their big problem. They don't have enough soldiers, not enough infantry. To take advantage of this situation to say, okay, the Russians are hiding, they're not coming out anymore, they don't have good logistics, but you have to observe the whole thing now, so to speak. From above, it shows how the ghost town was destroyed, how there are no more civilians there, and how the Russian army has essentially entrenched themselves in such a way that they can't be driven out for now. We also want to take a look at the map and observe that the situation in Sumy hasn't changed much in the past few weeks. There are Russian reports indicating that in Yunkivka, as we can clearly observe here, an advance has developed. As we can also see on the map, the entire area remains heavily contested. This indicates that there have been no successful Ukrainian counter-movements there yet, to put it cautiously. But we are currently viewing the images we just saw, which originate directly from Kindrka in the region. And we see that near Andriivka has been recaptured. Kindrka is still, at least according to this map, entirely under Russian control. Even though there are some reports from pro-Ukrainian sources, let's say, who are claiming that we are practically on the verge of recapturing it entirely. However, the footage just showed us that it's practically a ghost town, still under Russian control. All in all, however, it must be said, especially when comparing it to the region in Donetsk, to the situation in Donetsk, the situation here in Sumy has relatively stabilized, and currently there is no threat of a Russian breakthrough. Although the Ukrainian government had warned just weeks ago that 50,000 Russian soldiers were preparing to storm directly here in Sumy, moving from about 30 kilometers to now just 18 kilometers south of the front. We want to take a look at new Ukrainian footage, like these modern drones, which are also AI-controlled drones that have at least a target recognition system, how they are being utilized to destroy expensive Russian equipment. We're looking at what I find to be very high-quality footage, namely the approach of one of these AI drones. We can't say exactly where it's from. We know that Germany, Poland, and the US are currently supplying AI-assisted drones, and here we see one of these drones approaching a Buk M3 system of the Russian army. The Buk M3, one of the most advanced air defense systems the Russians have at their disposal, costs over 40 million euros and, as we're about to see, is completely defenseless against these small drones. Interestingly, here we see the approach once again, and precisely at the moment when the approach is happening, the Buk M3 system is adjusting its missile turret, essentially preparing itself. We can see here relatively well in terms of quality, both the large radar system on the front side and also the missiles on top. Even in this case, well, you can pause it. They even have drone defense. It's clearly visible. So here there are these structures above this triangle, and of course the drone in this case aims because it has a relatively small warhead. As mentioned, there's essentially it's high tech indeed, but not heavy, no heavy warheads like the Russians use, for example. We'll take a closer look shortly. It's aimed at the radar unit, not the missiles, as even a small explosion can effectively disable it. If it's hit, if it has fragmentation damage, then it's no longer functional. The Ukrainians are aiming with precision, and it's clearly marked on the left side. This is the approach we just saw from the drone's perspective. Now we're seeing it from a surveillance drone's view, and we can see a direct hit on the launcher, on the Buk M3 missile launcher. However, there's no major explosion from the missiles here, but instead it's most likely a precise strike on the radar system, which achieves the same outcome, or potentially even a more significant impact overall. Missiles can be replaced. Such a radar unit cannot be replaced so easily and would now require months of repair or even redesign, so to speak, to be restored. From Ukrainian drone units, we move to the Ukrainian Air Force. We want to take another look at how the Ukrainian Air Force is currently operating to bombard positions in the southern part of the country. This time we've obtained exclusive footage directly from a MiG-29 cockpit, showing how these strategic approaches are executed. And we can see it's truly a remarkable piloting feat, flying incredibly low here. We can see here this is all still manual. The joystick is essentially being used and held firmly by the pilot, who is about to transition into this brief catapult-like flight maneuver. So he goes up high, briefly skims over the ground, drops these 4 GBU-39 bombs, which are all guided but must be released from a certain altitude so they achieve their range, since they lack their own propulsion. And now we're about to see the impacts here. And it's quite interesting. These are hardened Russian bunkers that they're being used against in the south of the country. There is of course, this extensive Russian defense line. So here, for example, we see the flintstone coming out of the ground from this hardened structure. Now we're about to see from a distance exactly where 3 of the 4 bombs have landed here. 1, 2, 3, all 3 have hit. We don't know where the 4th one was, whether it malfunctioned or if perhaps he only had 3 on board. And interestingly, we just have to wait a few seconds now and we'll immediately see a black one right here. Black explosions, and here we can see them now, these black explosions. And this clearly shows us that there was a bunker underneath where the ammunition exploded. And from this bunker, so to speak, what we're seeing here is essentially just earth being flung upwards. That means a few seconds after the impacts of the American precision bombs, there was a massive underground explosion. The ammunition of the Russians exploded, and accordingly, let's rewind briefly. And thus, shortly after, there was this secondary explosion underground. Let's take another look. So now, the moment when this flies up, it comes back down, so to speak, everything settles again, and we know that underground there was a heavy explosion, likely from Russian ammunition for the artillery systems, which were hidden in that region. The MiG-29 then has to fly back at a low altitude accordingly, so that it cannot be detected and also cannot be attacked by Russian air defense systems. But we see that the pilots have now practically trained for this, have internalized it, and are carrying it out every single day. Finally, we want to turn our attention to the Russian drone attacks. Once again, focusing on Ukraine, we have truly unsettling footage from near Kiev, as the Russians claim. And this footage clearly illustrates the dual strike carried out by Geran-2 drones targeting a Ukrainian radar system. Here we see a 36D6 system, a costly and rare air surveillance radar, which is particularly crucial for the Ukrainians as they need to monitor their airspace and protect areas like Kiev. They're closely tracking the enemy's position. It's still unclear what's happening here. Apparently there are maintenance works or something similar here. In any case, it's a very precarious situation for the Ukrainians because this surveillance drone basically had so much time to transmit the data from these 2 actually mobile systems to inform the Russians 400 kilometers away. Warning, send these Geran-2 drones now. These Russians are coming at 200 kilometers per hour. That means they still need at least 2 hours for the approach, and yet the Ukrainian systems are still here, and these precious radar systems are about to be attacked by Geran-2 drones. We can see it here. There it is. I hope you spot it. The delta shape is tricky to see, but you should recognize it. That's the large Geran-2 drone with 50 kilos of explosives. and we'll see in a moment how it impacts this vehicle, causing significant damage. And right after that, here comes a second one. We'll also catch a quick glimpse of it in flight. It is about to be released momentarily. There we see it. Here it comes. A second one also heading straight for these two trucks equipped with the radar systems, and then causing extensive damage here to the Ukrainian radar. Yes, and of course, why did the Ukrainians stay here for hours? Why didn't they become aware that these systems, which were clearly spotted by the Russians, had been detected near Kiev, and why didn't they relocate for such an extended period, until the Russians could destroy it all with their drones? Of course, we don't know the answer. Nevertheless, this is a major problem for the Ukrainians, as every radar system monitoring the airspace over Kiev that's missing is one that leaves civilians with even less time to prepare for Russian airstrikes. How is Ukraine countering German 2 attacks? Primarily with advanced Western technology. And one of the high-tech systems we just witnessed in action is Rheinmetall's advanced Skynex defense system. We'll just leave that there for a moment. Presumably only one has been delivered to Ukraine so far. We can see it's something like a DOT, high-energy machine gun, essentially something with a radar system, with a target acquisition system built into it, and is capable of shooting down these German 2 drones. We're just going to let it run now, and the Ukrainians are showing us essentially how they operate this system, which is stationed at some secret location. It's now engaging the target. Here too we can always see this delta shape very clearly. It's evident that these are Shahed 136 drones, their previous designation, or Geran 2 drones. And interestingly, we also see here that the target crosshair is directly aligned with the drone. This means as an operator you don't have to calculate the lead angle here. Actually, you naturally have to aim ahead to ensure that you can hit the drone at a certain distance. Nonetheless, the computer handles that, the system does it on its own. And we see that the Ukrainians are relatively successful in shooting down drones with this Skynex system. However, crucially, they reportedly have just one system with a range of only a few kilometers, which significantly limits its effectiveness. Even if it is very good for the individual system, overall it is relatively limited. And Ukraine would need much more of it, especially considering what we've seen in recent nights. Up to 700 drones in a single night to be able to shoot them down. In the end, we'll see another perspective, not necessarily from this system, but from a different one, how these Geran 2s appear when they're struck in flight and begin to crash. That means there are indeed many success reports from the Ukrainians, who every night, or at least when attacks occur, they shoot down most of them. The Ukrainians occasionally report up to 95%. The real figures might be slightly lower than that. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have numerous means to defend themselves, though they naturally still need much more, because we have observed. A single Skynex system and its ammunition are only enough for a very limited time span. If Ukraine must continue defending against Putin's aggression for months or even years, they'll need much greater support from the West.